So, thank you all so much for being here for the beginning of this season of creation and also for this series on eco-apocalypse. Dr. Kyle Lamberle, who happens to also be my spouse, if you didn't guess, is here with us today and will be during adult formation for the next 3 weeks. He's a professor at Candler, professor of ethics and formation. And is actually teaching a class on eco-apocalypse this semester at Candler School of Theology. So just delighted that he's here with us today and that we get to spend some more time with him this month. So thank you so much, Kyle, for being
here. Good morning, Kyle. Thank you, Reverend Nicole. It's good to be with you all this morning, this season of creation. If you're like me, maybe season of creation was news to you. I didn't know that we had such a season, so I had to do a little research and figure out where this came from, what this is about. So just a little context for you. It's an ecumenical initiative started by Orthodox traditions in 1989 and was picked up then by the World Council of Churches, and currently is celebrated across Roman Catholic, Anglican, Orthodox traditions, and beyond. So it starts on September 1 and continues through the feast day of St. Francis, which is October 4th. And it offers Christians across the globe a time to reflect, pray, act with, and on behalf of the earth, our common home. So in our study over these next 3 weeks and in your liturgy here at Epiphany, you'll be reflecting with, focusing on creation as the oikos, or the household of God. If you haven't read it already, there's a joint statement from the Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew, Pope Francis, and Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, and I commend it to you. It's a really excellent statement, very theologically, it's short, but it's also theologically rich, and it's a great example of ecumenical cooperation. We don't see these kind of joint statements very often, but it's a really beautiful example of Christian leaders joining together in common cause. So all this to say, that's just a little background on season of creation. All this to say, I'm really glad to be with you these 3 weeks and looking forward to the conversation that will unfold together. So let's start. Make sure my thing is working here. Clicker. Technology, get there. All right. Have you seen this cartoon? Or yeah, I see some shaking heads. Anybody willing to describe it for those who are on Zoom? What do you see? The top caption reads, "Turf War on West 49th Street." On the left, if you're looking at the left side, it says, "The end is near for religious reasons." And has a rather scraggly looking John the Baptist type. And then on the right, "The end is near for ecological reasons." And what looks like maybe a librarian on the right, facing off. So this is, I thought, funny in an anxious sort of way about what it is we're facing. You may identify more with the fellow on the left or the right, not sure, but though the creation is the occasion for our gathering, the season of creation, we're going to dwell on that other extreme of salvation history at the end. And over the next 3 weeks, we'll be dwelling with this dangerous, challenging, disclosing language, lens, and practice of apocalypse. And I'm going to say more about what I mean by apocalypse in a moment, but for now, let me just perform the genre. The end is nigh. The seas are rising. The mountains are burning. The moon has turned red with blood. These are not the lines from an ancient apocalyptic text. No, these are the headlines from media coverage of anthropogenic, in other words, human-caused climate change. Just in the last couple of weeks, Hurricane Ida slammed into the Gulf Coast and inundated communities from New York to New Orleans. Fires have consumed hundreds of thousands of acres in California due to long-term droughts. Just as the Golden Ray cargo ship has finally this week been dismantled and removed from St. Simon's Sound, a new oil leak has been discovered in the Gulf of Mexico. Right here in the South DeKalb community of Stonecrest, mostly Black residents are fighting to limit toxic industrial hazards near their homes. So the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, is a UN-sponsored organization tasked with distilling the latest scientific data on climate change and distributing it to governmental leaders. So they've been around for several decades, but they just in August published their latest report, or part of a report, the AR6, and they found that, quote, it is unequivocal that human influence has warmed the atmosphere, ocean, and land. Widespread and rapid changes in atmosphere, ocean, cryosphere, and biosphere have occurred. More, human-induced climate change is already affecting many weather and climate extremes in every region across the globe. The weather, fires, hurricanes, ever more rapid melting of glacial ice, these signs of the times reveal the combined and uneven topography of climate catastrophe. The end of the world as we know it is not something that is coming in the future, but is something that is happening right now. Right now, we're living through this. So Megan Garber of The Atlantic recently declared, apocalypse is now a chronic condition. The question we'll be exploring over these next few weeks is, what should we make of this apocalyptic tone taken up by politicians, journalists, activists, scientists? Is it a cudgel to action? Is it a vector of religious violence? Is it a depoliticizing rhetorical salve? Let me pause here for a moment, though. This is a lot. Wicked problems of our planetary crisis can be overwhelming. So let's take a moment to just take stock of our own affective responses to all this. How does this make you feel? Not a rhetorical question for you in the room. Hopeless.
Panicky.
Panic, yeah. Alarm. Overwhelmed.
Resign.
Resign. Yeah, maybe, I don't know if folks on Zoom are getting in as well, but you're welcome to add your comments into the chat box.
Well, you know, the slogan, just wait and something awful will happen. Something like that. We've been recycling before 50 years. We still do.
Yeah. Yeah, I think.
All the rest of us do. Are we doing it? All of it?
No, we all pick up small practices that it's hard to know what do we add up to in this climactic global problem.
Not even a drop in the bucket.
Not even a drop in the bucket. Right. So, given this intensity of emotions and the wide range, it can feel everything from kind of perverse excitement of what will come next to real fear, resignation, depoliticized. Well, what can we do? It's all going to hell in a handbasket. Given this range of emotions, I've been fascinated to observe that the public response to our planetary crisis. We not only Christians who have this sort of apocalyptic rhetoric in our background, in our tradition, but scientists, politicians, pundits, and more have taken up this apocalyptic tone. We can look, for example, just at some of the recent responses to the Ipcc report. Some journalists and pundits have spoken of the climate crisis with an air of inevitability, kind of resigned inevitability, noting that these changes are already happening and they're unlikely to be undone. So here's Tom Engelhardt from The Nation. The apocalypse will not be slow, he says. All of us are in a new world. We better get used to it. Engelhardt's approach is to emphasize not future collapse, but current catastrophe. He says, quote, so welcome to my and your extreme world. Not next month or next year or next decade or next century, but right now. It's a world of disaster worth mobilizing over, if, that is, you care about the lives of all of us, and particularly of the generations to come. So interesting that he puts it in the subjunctive, if you care about those things, well, you might want to act. Jesuit priest Thomas Rees takes up a similar tone. The climate apocalypse is real, and it is coming. For Rees, apocalyptic in this case means unprecedented. Civilization is heading toward the worst catastrophe in human history. Unlike war, a pandemic, or a depression, this is not a disaster that we can recover from in a few decades, he says. This is a calamity that will take centuries, if not millennia, to recover from, if recovery is even possible. So, the message seems to be that what is happening is inevitable. There's no turning back. We're already over the cliff. Others, and the task then is to adapt to this new world that we're living in. Others, though, see not the end. They see climate alarmism and try to refute that. So Julia Musto on Fox News says, scientists challenge alarm bells in Ipcc climate change report. Not the end of the world. So here, scientific nuance serves to tamp down the prophets of doom, soothsayers of doom. Michael Schellenberger, who's the author of Apocalypse Never, an environmentalist, is quoted saying, quote, we are more resilient to changing temperatures than we've ever been, and it's just not the end of the world, end quote. So don't be so alarmist about all this. Still, another approach, rather than the inevitability or denial, you might say, others use the announcement as a cudgel to emergency action. So here's Brad Plummer and Henry Fountain in the New York Times. They combine this sense of inevitability with a call to action. A harder future than certain climate panel warns, but how hot is up to us. Here in the Boston Globe, Sabrina Shankman takes a similar tone, announcing, welcome to the climate apocalypse. It will get worse. So these are just some responses from this latest Ipcc report. Go deeper, and it's all very apocalyptic sounding. But why? Why do we turn in the face of climate crisis? Why do we turn to the apocalypse? Yes.
What is IPCC?
The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the UN group that distills all that scientific information. Why do we turn to this? It's a great question. If I'm moving too quickly, slow me down and ask that for clarification. But why do you think we turn to this apocalyptic language when encountering climate crisis?
To
motivate people? Okay, yeah.
It's sort of a media style, to be as negative as possible, to get people's attention.
Yeah, it's like clickbait strategy.
I think there are a lot of people who are not religious who, or maybe they have a simplistic urge to that, and they like the way to fear God, the way God is insulted. Bad things are happening.
Yeah, so it's part of our sort of wider cultural background, this sort of vestige of maybe a Christian past that we don't often access, but it's still there, kind of in the water, activated. John?
I just don't know a better word.
Yeah.
John says, I just don't know if there's a better word to describe what we're encountering. Paul?
For some people, is it a way to locate the source of the crisis outside ourselves? Maybe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so Paul's suggestion is maybe it's a way to externalize. For some, it's a way to externalize our sense of where the crisis lies. Maybe it's a function of just trying to make sense of a really difficult problem, very complex problem. I'll force it into a simplistic narrative. I can't see what's happening on Zoom, but I don't know if other folks are weighing in. Yeah, Barbara.
I think that, but I think that some people say, "Oh, it's God's will. It's in the bigger thing. He's trying to destroy the raise off for."
Yeah, some folks will put this off onto God, God's providence, God's taking care of it, or it's God's judgment.
Yeah. So is that what the evangelical or fundamental is saying? Is that it's nothing to do with us? Do they call it just liberals call it nothing?
Yeah, I think what's interesting is lots of different, it doesn't neatly fall into one camp. So lots of folks across the Christian spectrum pull on this language, and lots of people well beyond people who are not Christian in any way turn to this powerful language. It seems to bring some energy to what rightly feels like an emergency. So many have found such apocalyptic proclamations disturbing. Yeah.
So I have a comment. I read a lot of physical and natural science just as a lay reader.
Sure.
So people in the science community will agree that the end of the world is inevitable. It will end. Everything ends. Nothing lasts forever.
Sure.
In 5 billion years, the sun will expand and accelerate.
Right.
Well, we won't be around. So it's going to come to the question is, how will it come to it? Mm-hmm. Maybe we're beginning to, we know it's going to end at some point. So maybe that's what we're beginning to see. But we don't really know. So that can lead to an attitude of resignation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the comment for those on Zoom was, we all know that eventually the world will end, whether it's the sun expands and or everything in the universe is slowly moving away from us, and it will ultimately we'll all just freeze. But that's on a billion year time scale.
Very long time.
But the point was, it can lead to a sense of resignation, right? Sort of determinism. We don't have much power to chart our course here. So, Annunciations of the End, this apocalyptic sensibility, has long troubled scholars, pundits, religious folks, theologians get worried about the apocalyptic. Such attributions bring to mind the wild-eyed street preacher, the bunker-dwelling conspiracy theorist prepper, remember, these folks. Natural scientists will worry about the epistemic confidence of a claim to already know. So, the sense that we already know how this is all going to turn out. Do we? And there's limits to predictive modeling, and we rightly critique the temptations to exaggeration. That kind of confidence is often accompanied by a fixation on a specific date of the end. The end is coming in 12 years, because that's what the Ipcc says. Fascination with the end can indicate a psychological malady for people with inordinate hatred of self and others. Often enough, predictions of impending judgment simply fail to materialize, leading to an ever-updating doomsday clock. So when the predicted end does not come, or even before it arrives, such prophets of doom sometimes take matters into their own hands, leading to horrific acts of violence. Secular politicians will dismiss the obviously religious undertones of such predictions as psychologically satisfying, but ultimately misleading. Especially in our late modern context, apocalyptic speculation often correlates with brutality, with terrorism, as adherents attempt to bring God's kingdom to earth by their own powers, or if not motivating acts of violent enactment, an apocalyptic strategy may perversely underwrite quiescence, this throwing up of our hands before the habits that sustain today's fossil fuel empire. So Christian theologians and ethicists then may dismiss these apocalyptic speculations as pseudo-theologies that instrumentalize the vestiges of theological past and our cultural imagination for political purposes. An apocalyptic imagination, it seems, doesn't offer a reasonable mode of thought for modern people concerned with ecological collapse. So I was talking a few weeks ago to my colleague at Candler, Susan Hyland, New Testament professor, who teaches a class on Revelation, Book of Revelation, and she told me we have basically two options when it comes to the apocalyptic. We have a fundamentalist version that reads the Revelation of John, that last book of our scripture, as soothsaying speculations like the Left Behind novels. That's one option. Or, well, we don't really have another option. That's it. Mainline folks, Episcopalians like us, we don't tend to engage much in the apocalyptic. It's too much. It's too weird. It's too violent. Too symbolic. But my interest here, just to lay it out on the table, is to look again at the apocalyptic as a theological resource. Clearly, many of us who pay attention to the environment are drawn to this strange, dangerous genre. And I'm interested to see what resources are available within the apocalyptic for engaging our planetary crisis. But what do we mean? What is the apocalyptic? Let's work on these definitions a little bit. Scholars have spent considerable ink reining in a definition of the apocalyptic. One such scholar, biblical scholar John Collins, has identified the apocalyptic as kind of the field-shaking definition as a genre of revelatory literature within a narrative framework in which a revelation is mediated by an otherworldly being to a human recipient, disclosing a transcendent reality, which is both temporal insofar as it envisages eschatological salvation, and spatial insofar as it involves another supernatural world. So this, the wonky definition, a lot in there. So Collins is working across ancient Near Eastern literature, so some of our scriptural sources as well as beyond them, to see what is it about this genre that emerges in the ancient Near East. In books like the book of Daniel have a kind of apocalyptic paradigm there. Well, it's a genre of literature, revelatory literature, sits within a story, a narrative framework. It's mediated by some otherworldly being given by an angel or messenger of God, and involves disclosing, uncovering, giving access to a reality that's not immediately present to us. So that's one very wonky definition. Considering the kind of apocalypticism that pervades contemporary culture, scholar of religion Francis Flannery suggested that apocalyptic is an ideology. It's an orientation to reality that maintains that the divine or transcendent realm has sent a revelation to a select few persons, the righteous, disclosing the divine view through a transformative or meaningful experience. So Flannery's concern especially is how that then goes on to motivate religious violence. Because it's for a select few. It's the only ones who know. And then they enact God's will on earth. Theologian Brian Robinette has given a different approach to find apocalyptic eschatology as a theological approach that stresses divine faithfulness and vindication, universal cosmic expectation, cosmic, temporal, and social duality, and a historical imminence. So Robinette is one of several theologians, Kathryn Keller, Cyril O'Regan, Phil Ziegler, who have engaged apocalyptic eschatology as a prominent stream of the theological tradition, a canonical stream, from which to make constructive theological claims. So all these are big scholarly definitions. I want to just get right into the etymology of it, though. Apocalypse means to uncover, literally apo, calyptine, to cover, so apocalyptic, to uncover, to disclose. Rather than meaning the end of the world per se, which is where our cultural imagination often goes, apocalypse is an uncovering, a disclosure, a revelation. It need not be future-oriented. Sometimes it is, but can be oriented to the here and now. So many biblical scholars have come to read the Apocalypse of John, the book of Revelation, as a critique of Roman Empire, the hegemonic power in the author's own time. To announce the end of that world was to proclaim that Rome is not final. This too will come to an end. So, definitions are notoriously slippery, but as we work with it over the next few weeks, this is how I want to approach it. I want to shift our question from when is the world going to end to what is being revealed, what is being disclosed, what's being uncovered. And then to follow from these disclosures, how can we live amid this ending? So let's spend just a moment with this question. What is being revealed? What do you see as we read the signs of the end times? Again, not a rhetorical question. We'd love to hear. What are you seeing? What do you, as you maybe amateur or professional readers of scientific data, what do you see?
Well, if you're gonna uncover something, you're gonna uncover those people and other, well, not just traditions, but in other realms of the entire world.
Like
I think
practical
that.
things like ocean warming, water raising, CO2 becoming higher water. Is that what you mean by feeling?
Sure, it's an open-ended question, not meant to be very direct.
So I mean, it's kind of a philosophical.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there's some physical science basis to what's being revealed. There's increased CO2, there's raising sea levels, there's ocean acidification. Paul?
I would just say that all of what's happening in the environment is so incredibly interrelated, maybe in ways that, you know, we tend to look at things over here and over here and over here, and it's all part of a system that is just breaking down. It's interrelated.
Yeah, so there's one of the things we might be able to see that is being revealed is the way in which things are connected. We are connected. We are creatures in ecosystems that we are dependent on other creatures.
So again, as a person who reads a lot of stuff, I'm very aware that there are a few of things that terrible. You know, we see the world darkly. It's the rough flash. I suspect it's very limited. We know that we perceive only a very tiny portion of what is actually the world. You know, there are all these things we don't see. There are all these little atoms and molecules way below any level. Things are not what they seem. So, but the question of what is being revealed, that's a really good question. I certainly claim that I have no idea what's being. Yeah, because our ability to perceive are so limited.
Our abilities to perceive are limited, and so who are we to presume to know?
Exactly.
But I guess we can say, I think we can say, challenge that a little bit over the last 200 years. We can say that our actions, what's being revealed is that our actions are contributing to these changes.
Yeah, so we know now something about human activity, or at least the activity of some humans, not a species-wide activity, but the activities of some of us, who, especially those of us who are dependent and use fossil fuels on a regular basis, are having a significant impact on the planet that we all share. So, yeah.
And I think of what's being revealed in 20 years, the driving, motoring my big cars, the NASCAR race, I'm drinking Diet Coke bottles, throwing in the trash, just thinking what's being revealed, the consequences of that kind of choices, broad terms.
Yeah, we have a greater sense now, probably, of our complicity, the consequences of this, all the daily actions that we take up, driving in the NASCAR.
We used to think about how this being a solution. So we raised our stacks about 2,000 feet. Then we found out, well, when you add it all together, you have it solved. But the solution is there. Everywhere.
Yeah. There's a fundamental myth that's part of our political economy and process of natural exploitation that you can just externalize these costs onto creation, so the solution to pollution is dilution, or onto other people, so our neighbors in South DeKalb.
Just another comment. It's clear.
Bruce, you're making too much.
I'm not making too It's clear to me that what agrees or doesn't agree that human activity is. It's still very clear that we need to be very careful. It doesn't matter, we see these things occur. It doesn't matter whether they're caused by people or not. So what? They're happening, and we need. If there's anything we need to do it.
Yeah, so some urgency there from Bruce and Paul.
I think another thing that's being revealed is we have a tendency to think that we can fix everything as modernists. And this may be something that's too big for us to fix. And so it's revealing our powerlessness in the face of something far greater than us.
This is part of the deep, what French sociologist Emile Durkheim would call anomie of our state, our age, our paradox that lies at the center of our conversation here, that at the same time as we note that human actions are causing, it's human power that's causing this crisis, we are unable to fix it. We seem unable to fix it. So here are 4 eco-apocalyptic theses, 4 thoughts that might that I think are being revealed that build on a lot of the great comments that you have already made. The world as we know it is ending. The world as we know it is ending. A relatively stable climate that we have enjoyed for most of human history is coming to an end. So the world is ending, but the earth will be fine. The world here, as I'm using it, and as I think the apocalyptic invites us to use it, Scripture invites us to use it, is the social imaginary, the political economy that structures our relationships with one another and with creation. So that's the world, thinking in this scriptural imagination of what does it mean that the world might end? Well, the world as we know it is built on divisions of race, class, gender, and nature. The world is violent and inescapable. The world will end. That's good news. The world will end. It's not final. We should not want to sustain these violent and inescapable relations. It's good news for the earth that this world, as we know it, will end. Second, we are creatures. We are not the creator. Humans have the capacity to create climate change, but it does not mean we have the capacity to uncreate it. This is part of the deep challenge of our moment. We are, as Genesis suggests, dirt with breath. We are creatures. So how might we learn to be creatures again? We can learn from those who have already lived through the end of the world. That's what our apocalyptic traditions capture in the book of Daniel, in the apocalypse of John, in the little apocalypses of Jesus. These are people who are living through the ends of their worlds, whose backs are against the wall. We can learn from those indigenous traditions in which they have lived through the apocalyptic ending of their cultures and societies. There's wisdom in that experience. We can learn from the descendants of slaves whose world was ended by the terror of colonialism. We can learn from those sources. Those are apocalyptic sources that we can learn from. And then finally, building on Paul's earlier comment, we cannot fix the problem. We're no longer in the register of fix. But that doesn't mean there's nothing to do. That doesn't mean we simply throw up our hands. There are practices, good practices that we can cultivate in the midst of this ending. We can learn how to live within ending. Practices of judgment, coming to judgment about what it is we're experiencing together. Practices of lament, lamenting the loss of good spaces of ecological creation, of conversion, turning toward a creaturely way of being with one another and being before God, of care. Even if we don't save the world, are there things worth caring for in the midst of it? Things that will die, including our earth. Our earth will die. But is it still worth caring for? We will die. Are we worth caring for? I think so. And there's good things to be done in the midst of world endings. So let me give you a sense of where we're going from here. we're going to continue to ask this question: what is being revealed? Why do we turn to this strange, dangerous language of apocalypse? And in particular, we want to ask this question: what is the good news amid world's ending? What's the good news? This is what I ask my students at Candler. They don't particularly like this question right at the beginning of the semester, but this is what we ask across the whole semester. What is the good news? So next week, we'll turn especially to Scripture as a resource for the apocalyptic imagination. So I already mentioned a few examples of apocalyptic genre from Scripture: Daniel, the little apocalypse of Mark, the book of Revelation, and look at what do we mean scripturally by apocalypse. So we have all this cultural imagination, and some of that is scripture adjacent, but much of it kind of leads us astray. So we'll be getting into what is a scriptural apocalyptic imagination. And then the final week, we'll take up a set of spiritual practices that I've already mentioned: of judgment, of lament, conversion, care, that enable us. These are practices for living within endings. They enable us to live as creatures. We're still creating God who cares for creation. So that's where we're heading over these next few weeks. I realize our time is getting short, so I'll stop there, but I'm happy to respond to any questions or take other comments or thoughts as we wrap up.
Well, I thought the definition of apocalypse, you have to learn that it's something that's really.
Something you can take with you.
Yes, I can take with me. I want to see if there's suddenly the burning up of everything in that land.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's the Fox News piece that I shared earlier on, like the denialists. If apocalypse means it's all going to burn up, clearly they can say no, it's not. Something will continue, even if we take the worst scenario of the Ipcc. They kind of game out these different scenarios. Even the worst scenario, something of our physical earth will remain, but it's not a world that we really be excited about living in. So I'll think about apocalypse a little differently as uncovering. I open up our imagination in a different way. Paul?
In these theological resources, scripture and other resources in our tradition, do you see people using those in both creative and generative ways, and also in sort of negative ways that exclude that identify certain people as chosen to survive?
Yeah, absolutely. So Paul's lifting up, you can see apocalypse being used in generative ways, but what about the more nefarious aspects? And those are absolutely there. And that's why it's important to me to name the apocalyptic as a dangerous genre. It has power. It's attractive in some ways, but it's also been used for very nefarious purposes. So one theologian I mentioned very briefly, Kathryn Keller, has for the course of her decades-long career been writing about the apocalypse. And she started with a very suspicious approach to the apocalypse. So this was during the Reagan era, in which it was a very apocalyptic foreign policy that was nefarious and problematic, and in some ways we still live in the wake of that kind of us and them duality that sorts all of everyone into friends and enemies, and that can have deeply nefarious effects. But in her last book, Facing the Apocalypse, even Keller is turning to the apocalyptic as still a productive resource for thinking about how do we live in the midst of endings. So it's a resource that should be handled with care, as all theological resources should be. They all can be used. There's no pure or unalloyed good theological resource. So it takes reason and careful thought to draw on these in a productive way.
It seems to be true that if we're unveiling, all that we are unveiling, we're talking about this for unveiling things we very much, but it doesn't have to be that way. There's unveiling things that we don't know about that we're looking to see. So the unveiling could be a positive thing. But I think I like to look at unveiling as not just where it's gone wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's part of what turning to Scripture will help us do, is to see that what is unveiled is not merely gloom and doom. That's a kind of pseudo-apocalyptic. But what is revealed is new heaven, new earth. It's not different from the heaven and earth of this good creation, but it's new, it's genuinely new. A new way of relating before God. So there are reasons to hope. And one of the questions we'll be asking as we go forward is what practices help us attend to those reasons for hope, even in the midst of what is deeply troubling about our climate. All right, well, we'll stop there and look forward to seeing you all next week or in service momentarily.
Thank you, everybody at home, for joining us. If you have any notes about how it went today from your end, feel free to email me on that. We'll try to revise and make it better for you next time if we can. Good to see you.